Good evening, Kathy, and good morning from Christchurch. You're right. Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister here, her office has confirmed that she had received an email just before the attack warning of its imminence. And this was sent to an email account not personally checked by the Prime Minister, but it was also sent to a number of political figures here, media organisations. It did not spell out specifically what was about to unfold, and it is very unclear what could have actually been done to prevent it, had it done so. Now, it turns out that this suspect, the 28-year-old Australian Brenton Tarrant, was on nobody's watch list. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, had said he wasn't on anyone's radar anywhere. And Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, said he should have been. She actually said this individual should have been someone that the authorities were aware of and proactively focused on. And those are the exact questions that we have asked and that our agencies are focusing on. Now, she has been quite outspoken in the past 24 hours. She has notably, as you'll see in my report, mentioned reform of the firearms laws. She also mentioned a conversation that she'd had with Donald Trump in the wake of the massacre. He'd called it a horrible massacre. And said, what can I do to help? The president had been praised in this manifesto for being a symbol of renewed white identity and common purpose. And very pointedly, Jacinda Ardern told him, my message was sympathy and love for all Muslim communities. And as you'll see from what lies behind me here, this accumulating mountain of a wall of flowers which has become a makeshift shrine in Christchurch, that has been the message New Zealanders and their Prime Minister have been sending out.
In what the Maori here call Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, a fog of tearful anguish has descended on the biggest city on South Island. At the Botanic Gardens, resplendent bouquets were reverently laid. Well, after what Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern yesterday called one of New Zealand's darkest days, today, frankly, hasn't been much brighter. There is a visceral sense of raw grief here in Christchurch. A city stunned by the enormity of what has happened here and by the sheer cold-blooded nature of its execution. In their bereavement, the small Muslim community of Christchurch cried, "There is no God but God." The response across New Zealand? Here, there is no place for hate. Yes, this nation's stunned, but probably not shocked that violent white supremacism should have reared its head. It's just that in this peaceful country, small and geographically remote, they really hadn't seen it coming.
It's horrible. It's unbelievable. It's incomprehensible. Yeah, I just... And today, I even just started to feel a bit angry, How dare someone come here and do this? It's pretty bad. And as Jacinda said, this is not us.
Oh, we've been through the earthquakes, we've been through a lot, like fires, earthquakes, and this is probably the worst thing of everything. Like it's not great at all. It's everyone's probably on edge. It'll change everything for a long, long time.
Can it recover?
Oh, of course, we stand together, we're strong, but it'll leave a scar, that's for sure. Yeah, it's pretty hefty.
Brenton Harrison Tarrant.
Today, prime suspect Australian Brenton Tarrant was charged with murder. The judge ordered his face be blurred to preserve his fair trial rights. Tarrant showed no emotion and appeared to make a white power symbol. We've chosen not to show this. The judge remanded him without a plea. Turkish authorities released a still of the suspect at Istanbul airport in 2016, saying his contacts and movements were being investigated. Tarrant said he'd hatched his plan after visiting Europe. As yet, no one's sure just where he went and who he met there. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern flew in. She'd said her country had probably been targeted because it represented kindness and compassion, offering refuge for those who needed it.
a home for those who share its values. She told Muslim leaders she'd come to bring a message of love and support from her grieving compatriots. She also listened to her hosts.
New Zealand is a place that we cherish equally for its inclusiveness, for its diversity. And I will consider it my personal mission as Prime Minister to defend that so long as I have the privilege of holding this office.
Later, at a news conference, Ardern addressed the vexed issue of how the killer could have obtained his lethal arsenal. Enough, she said. The loopholes must be closed.
While work is being done as to the chain of events that led to both the holding of this gun licence and the possession of these weapons, I can tell you one thing right now. Our gun laws will change.
49 dead, 36 remain in hospital, 11 in intensive care. Outside, I met Nazim. His family's worshipped in the Al-Noor Mosque for 25 years.
My father, he was at the mosque at the time of the shooting, and basically the two guys on his right-hand side, they passed away. The two guys on his left-hand side, they passed away. He managed to escape through the side door, through to the car park, then jumped the fence through to the neighbors, and they aided him and helped them. So.
And what's his state of mind right now? He must have been terrified by this.
He's very terrified.
Kia kaha otaotahi. Stay strong, Christchurch. For all the pain, there is clear resilience. Investigation into possible failures of intelligence, wrangling over gun laws, and serious concerns over the live streaming of a massacre watched by kids on Facebook. These will come later. This weekend's from mourning.
Well, police in New Zealand have so far refused to name the victims, but the identities of some of the dead are emerging in the media as families of those who died have been paying tribute to them. 71-year-old Daoud Nabi was the first victim to be named. He moved to New Zealand with his family from Afghanistan in the 1980s. His son Omar said his father thought New Zealand was a slice of paradise and described his father's murder as outrageous. In Pakistan, the family of Naeem Rashid and his 21-year-old son Talha confirmed their deaths. Naeem Rashid had tried to save other worshippers by tackling the gunman. His family in Pakistan said they were in shock at the deaths. Bangladeshi media have reported that 42-year-old Hosna Ara, who was trying to find her wheelchair-bound husband during the attack, was also killed. Her husband is reported to have survived. And tributes have been paid to one of the youngest victims, 3-year-old Muqad Ibrahim, who became separated from his father and older brother when the firing started. An Australian senator who caused outrage by blaming the New Zealand attack on Muslim immigration has been egged by a teenager. Fraser Anning was being interviewed about his controversial statements when the 17-year-old smashed an egg on his head. The independent senator responded by punching the teenager before the youth was restrained on the floor. Police are now investigating Mr. Anning's actions. Well, I'm joined now by Akila Ahmed, who chairs the government's anti-Muslim hatred task force, and Hisham Helia, who specialises in international security at the Royal United Services Institute and has written books on politics and religions. Akila Ahmed first. Is there a sense that, given how open Tarrant seems to have been about his adherence to white supremacist beliefs, that the governments around the world have not noticed as much as they should have done the rise of the far right?
I think that's fair. I think governments and social media companies alike have been slow to respond to the threat posed by far-right and extreme far-right groups.
So what now needs to be done, in your view?
I think there needs to be a much better understanding of the global threat that's posed by these far-right groups at a policy level. And I think social media companies need to take more action. What we saw with the New Zealand attacker was that he live-streamed his attack on Facebook. And this did not happen. It did not happen in an isolated way. It did not come out of nowhere. Far-right groups who he gained his sort of ideas and ideologies from, they have used the internet to cultivate their narratives, to cultivate their hatred. And social media is key to that. And in fact, live streaming is a tool that they often use. We see figures like Stephen Yaxley, also known as Tommy Robinson, who regularly used Facebook to live stream his hatred, especially against Muslims, but in particular against immigrants. And even today, he posted on YouTube a video where he spoke about replacement theory, which is just outrageous. And now social media companies, they need to take action.
Well, Hisham Hellier, is it about social media companies taking action, or do governments need to force them to do so?
I think it's partly about social media, but I think it's also very much about political leadership. Our leadership, not simply in the United Kingdom, but across the European continent and throughout the West more generally, in my opinion, has failed to recognize how serious the threat comes from white supremacist groups. We've been very active and very acute to the threat that radical and extremist Islamism faces, but we haven't done quite the same when it comes to white supremacists. And I think that's very important, particularly in the aftermath of this attack.
Do you think that's a double standard, and why has that arisen? If it is?
There are a number of reasons for this, but particularly when it comes to white supremacism, it reflects, I think, a failing on us to see a problem that's really intrinsic and endemic within our own societies that we can't simply push to one side and say, oh, it's something that's not really to do with us. And white supremacism doesn't actually aim at disrupting societies from within the indigenous communities. On the contrary, it targets minorities, minority groups. And I think that people have a hard time admitting how mainstream a lot of that rhetoric actually is, and how far the responsibility for the rhetoric, not for the actions, but for the rhetoric being allowed to then allow space for the discourse of really violent discourse to then take place that results in attacks like this.
Akhila Ahmed, do you think Islamophobia in mainstream politics and in mainstream media is part of the problem here?
I think Islamophobia has now become widely accepted in society, unfortunately, and we're seeing it articulated in the media, unfortunately on the front pages of various tabloids and even other newspapers as well. We've seen politicians in the way that they would talk about Muslims, they would dehumanize Muslims. And earlier, over the summer, we saw how Boris Johnson referred to Muslim women as bank robbers and letterboxes. And after he wrote that article, I know Muslim women who, when they went on the bus, they were identifiably Muslim, they wore a hijab like I'm wearing, they were then called a bank robber by teenagers who were being abusive towards them. So the speech of politicians and the coverage of Muslims, the way they're reported about within the media, does have a direct impact on the everyday lives of Muslims. And this is part of a broader sort of acceptance that Islamophobia is okay. It's okay to say this about Muslims in a way that we would not talk about other ethnic minority groups or other faith groups.
We've seen widespread condemnation from across the political spectrum of this attack, of course. But is that what needs to be done to tackle that Islamophobia online and in politics?
So, for example, your report mentioned the senator in Australia that said these awful things in the aftermath of the attack, and he was roundly condemned by many politicians within Australia. Nobody's going to defend that. But this isn't the problem. The problem is that he doesn't come out of a vacuum. His rhetoric plays into a background of other statements that have come from across the political spectrum, not simply Australia, but across the West and more generally. That makes that sort of rhetoric more allowable, more acceptable, and then that plays into the discourse of more radical groups. And that's what happened with Anders Breivik in Norway in 2011, when he carried out his massacre, and then also this in New Zealand. So it's not about people condemning these attacks. That I think we can take for granted. It's about them then recognizing that their rhetoric and their discourse makes the radical discourse far more possible. And again, I'm not saying that these people are all to be blamed for the violent actions. That's not the point. But it makes it more plausible and allowable for that discourse to then develop.
Thank you both very much.